Alrighty, this is Chapter 5, Health and Healthcare from the Matrix of Race. So let's start off with the learning objectives for Chapter 5, which are to describe contemporary inequality in health and healthcare, to examine various stock narratives of inequality in health and medicine, to apply the matrix lens to the link between race, health, and medicine, and to explore alternatives to the current matrix of inequality in health and medicine. Alrighty, so patterns of inequality in health and healthcare. So disparities in health and mortality provide clear evidence of the long-term effects of structural racism. So types of disparities are often found in healthcare, right? So this could be quality of care, healthcare safety, sickness, and of course, death rates. So African Americans, Mexican Americans, American Indians, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and Asian Americans all have higher rates than whites of the deadliest diseases, such as heart disease and stroke, which kills many, many Americans every year. So while disease rates may be the same across racial groups, mortality or death rates may differ. For example, Black women are much more likely to die from breast cancer than white women. Right? So these health inequities in the U.S. are one consequence of a long history of structural racism. Life expectancy studies in the United States found that white men with 16 years or more of education live slightly more than 14 years longer than Black men that have less than 12 years of education. And we'll talk later about how education overlaps this a bit. So moving on to traditional medicine. This consists of indigenous knowledge, skills, and practices that have been passed down over generations. Many forms of traditional medicine were practiced throughout the Americas prior to colonization. And of course, traditional healers have not been valued by modern medicine because modern medicine has a very Western lens. Nevertheless, many people continue to rely on traditional healing. This has played an important role in U.S. Latino culture, among others. Much of our knowledge about medicinal qualities of specific plants and herbs comes from traditional medicine. Prior to the middle of the 1800s, medicine as an organized, institutionalized discipline did not exist. Facing competition from traditional healers, the doctors created the American Medical Association as a formal organization to define themselves as the only authentic and legitimate practitioners of medicine. The rise of modern medical practice in the United States was both shaped and reinforced by the broader culture of racism. Modern medicine was developed during the era of slavery, and slaves were frequently used for experiments. White doctors refused to treat Black patients after the end of the Civil War. And Southern doctors asserted that Blacks were different from whites and that they were unfit for freedom. So the American Medical Association also originally excluded Black physicians. So Black physicians formed their own organization, the National Medical Association, in 1908. The African American community mobilized with assistance from white philanthropists and limited government funds to establish their own medical community. But few hospitals would allow Black doctors to practice medicine. And African Americans in the South were more likely to die due to lack of medical care than whites. Hospitals in the South were also segregated. Black patients could only be admitted to 19 of 29 hospitals in New York City. And in 1910, white men were expected to live to 50, while African Americans were expected to live to about 34. So you can see how unequal access to healthcare and medicine affects overall life expectancy and how these things compound over time. And those hospitals, I should also note, were not desegregated until 1964. So we've talked a little bit about social construction and how our culture affects the way that we understand things. So we also have a social construction of what is fit and unfit in our culture. Medical institutions not only contributed to the system of white supremacy and supported legal and educational boundaries by separating Blacks from whites, they also played a central role in racializing other groups. The stock story of race as a biological reality is one of the most significant narratives, and this justifies health disparities by locating physical differences within the body. Debates on how races were derived characterized the early stages of science of race, and this was not resolved until the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, which outlined the theory of evolution in 1859. So Darwin asserted that all races evolved from the same organisms and thus were part of the same species. Darwin's theories sparked a new way of thinking about race and class. His perspective focused on the inheritance of genetic traits, which was thought to include physical and moral behavior. So social Darwinism took the basic insights of the theory of evolution and applied them to contemporary social life, assuming that a society could determine between fit and unfit. So Herbert Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And let me just do a little baby tangent here, as I want to clarify what survival of the fittest meant in evolutionary theory and how it's misinterpreted by Herbert Spencer's ideology. So this idea of fittest is used as best or strongest, right? And that's why the dinosaurs are here today, because the biggest and baddest survive. Not so much. Survival went to those who were the most adaptable, as they could easily fit into changing environments and thrive. So you can see how Spencer's interpretation is a bit flawed, but also how you could use that same logic to say that African American family forms are the fittest because they're the most adaptable to changes in the social environment. So anywho, Spencer argued that the imagined laws of natural selection were against intervention to help the poor, meaning if they were fit, they would survive. And by misinterpreting Darwin's theories, he could argue it was better for society to let poor people die off, and this affected ideology and policy decisions for generations. Again, it's a misinterpretation of Darwin, as evolution works slowly over millions of years, not in one generation. There's no way of knowing who is or isn't fit. Instead, that fitness is determined by a specific historical, environmental, and climate contexts. But this ideology was used and is still used as a justification to not help the poor, which is why it's so troubling and why we need to understand how racist and flawed this interpretation is. The rise of the eugenics movement in the late 19th century took the social Darwinist philosophy further. It argued that natural selection should be hastened by policies to encourage the fit, upper-class whites, to reproduce. It also argued that the unfit should be sterilized, which kind of, unfit meaning everyone who wasn't white and upper class. Social Darwinists argued that society should not be helping the unfit to survive by providing them with forms of charity. Measures were also suggested to encourage the fittest to marry each other and reproduce in order to increase the fit population. And of course, this occurred within the broader context of a system of white supremacy, as an ideology that affected who's considered most marriageable or most fit. So eugenics was legitimized when the AMA, right, that we talked about before, included among its published goals to apply a, quote, scientific process of selection, end quote, to control the growth of, quote, unfortunate classes, end quote. So this has a long-term impact on the social organization of medicine in the country. So people believe that by removing those incapable of living up to high moral and physical standards, they could protect the purity and fitness of the white race. These efforts went so far as to attempt to protect the sensibilities of the fit by keeping the quote-unquote defectives literally out of sight, such as the 1911 Chicago Ugly Law, that declared that no person whose disease, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be unsightly or disgusting or improper person to be allowed in or on the public ways or in public places in the city shall therein or thereon explore himself to public view. So simply just having a deformity, being maimed. And again, think about who is more likely to suffer those kinds of situations: the poor and people of color who are in industries of work that are the most dangerous. The eugenics ideology permeated immigration policy as well. Beginning with the Immigration Law of 1891, the federal government classified this public charge that certain immigrants thought likely to depend on government assistance needed to be turned away. So any immigrant believed to suffer from a dangerous disease, such as poverty, being considered one of those diseases, was deported. And so now this is interesting in a country where we talk a lot about, people like to lean on that white ethnic ancestry of, oh, my grandfather came here with 2 cents in his pocket and all this kind of stuff. Well, then he's lucky if he circumvented the immigration law of 1891. They would have said he has the disease of poverty and needed to be, put somewhere else. So anyway, new methods were devised to determine who and what was, fit and who was not fit. And this ranged from new tools to measure the widths and angles of the face and the first IQ tests. So now, side note on IQ. The guy who initially developed it did so to identify students that were in need of academic help in order to single them out for additional study. It was accepted by Binet that the IQ could change and does change throughout a person's life. But here in the US, proponents of the IQ test said that it was fixed and could not improve. So your IQ at 10 years old is the same as at 20 years old, which is ridiculous, of course. But with this flawed perspective, IQ tests were put into use at Ellis Island. And those defined as morons, quote-unquote morons, were deported. Scores of women trained in the methods of spotting the feeble-minded were employed to identify misfits. Mind you, this is having people off a perilous journey who might not be fluent in English take an IQ test and then be told they're too dangerous to society because they're feeble-minded. A lot of the terms we use for stupid, like imbecile, idiot, moron, they're actually a scale of intelligence that was used to deport and then later forcibly sterilize mostly racial and ethnic minorities and poor whites. By the mid-1930s, more than 60,000 U.S. citizens were forcibly sterilized. 33 states adopted laws allowing eugenic sterilizations in order to decrease bad genetic traits. Despite widespread condemnation of Nazi practices of eugenics, the U.S. continued to carry out forced sterilizations after World War II to limit the birth of quote-unquote mental defectives. And California itself sterilized 20,000 people by 1963. As much as these sterilizations were part of history, they're also unfortunately still an ongoing issue, as from 2006 to 2010, there were at least 150 women who faced this issue in California prisons, almost all of them Latinas. This prompted then Governor Jerry Brown to sign a law that bans forced sterilization of women in prisons in 2014. Yet abuses still continue. So eugenics was inherently about the construction of whiteness, and it provides us with a clear example of the need for understanding race intersectionally. The whites who were seen as unhealthy and impure were the poor, the disabled, the homosexual, the not quite white, right? Like such as, ethnic minorities like the Jewish. They were targeted for segregation or elimination. Women's bodies, not men's, were most often targeted for sterilization. So eugenics ideology also connects to the search for defects to account for homosexuality. And this is, as something inherent that's in someone's body. So the invention of the homosexual, this idea of homosexuality, that there's a homosexual body and a homosexual person as opposed to simply sex acts or desires, occurred in the late 19th century discourse. As medical professionals began committing lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, or anyone really who transgresses our normative gender identities or expression, they would commit them to hospitals or mental institutions, jails. And in some cases, these people would undergo prefrontal lobotomies to cure them of their homosexuality. They'd undergo electroshock treatments, castration, and sterilization. The pathologizing of LGBT people of every race has continued. When the epidemic began in the early 1980s, AIDS became known as a gay man's disease, since gay men were among the first cases. The false assumption that the disease was the result of a lifestyle choice led heterosexuals to believe they were safe, and doctors to limit their study of the disease on men's symptoms only. It took over a decade before symptoms unique to women like cervical cancer were recognized. Another part of this is conversion therapy, or forced treatment programs. These are supposed to change someone's sexual orientation if they're gay or lesbian, and remains largely legal, though there are some places that ban it. So these programs are not medically oriented. They're not run by doctors. The basis for conversion therapy is the idea that homosexuality is a mental disorder that can be cured. It's, often referred to as praying the gay away. And again, some states now ban this for minors, but largely it is a process that still remains legal. So when applying theory to inequality in health and healthcare, the field of medical sociology is the sociological analysis of the practice and field of medicine and the social effects. And of course, this has changed. It's only in the past 50 years that it's become its own field within sociology. Medical sociology specialists and sociology courses on health and illness are much more common these days. And so these sociologists argue that health and illness are not simply biological phenomenon, it's also a social phenomenon. The sociology of health and healthcare is essential because it challenges many of our basic assumptions about illness. People who live in industrialized Western countries live much longer than people in previous centuries. But those gains have not been consistent across race and class groups. Education levels also add to this gap. So white men and women that have college education or higher have life expectancies at birth that were more than a decade longer than black men and women that have less than a high school degree. Among white and black men with a college education or higher, the gap is about 5 years. So to apply theory to this, Frederick Engels compared the lifespans of the wealthy with the significantly shorter lifespans of the working class, blaming social factors such as dangerous work environments and poor living conditions. And he helped, along with Marx, develop conflict theory, right? And conflict theorists argue that the economic interests play the most significant role in determining health outcomes, that profit motives drive the definitions of diseases. So this motivates pharmaceutical companies to invest into their money into research that will find drugs that will sell, be able to be sold to a large number of people, rather than prioritizing a way to, bolster up public health needs. So economic interests impact who's most likely to get sick, the kind of treatment that someone will get, right? And as we discussed before, many researchers have also suggested it's no coincidence that poor communities are the most frequently home to toxic waste dumps and other hazardous sites that can cause ill health, problems. So conflict theorists point out that the U.S. healthcare system is driven by profit, so the wealthy have better access to high-quality healthcare. Seen from this perspective, our medical system reinforces inequality and serves as a form of social control. And if you apply the matrix of health inequity and inequality, this really looks at how healthcare as an institution is deeply enmeshed in other social institutions. So taking an intersectional approach to health and healthcare, we have to look at how stock stories portray health as a matter of individual success or failure. And they basically ignore the role of institutional class and race inequities, and really the unequal outcomes that come as a result of that. Instead, they focus on the individual level. And the work of home health care has also fallen on the shoulders of women. As childcare is assumed to be women's work, now more people are living longer and they need more care as they age. So it's often women who shoulder these additional burdens. Women, and predominantly women of color, are expected to work outside the home while still caring for disabled or aging family members. For example, according to research in the book, for Chinese women, the strong ideology that commitment to family trumps career leads to a sense of obligation to care for their elders, even if it means leaving their own jobs and relocating to be near their families. Overall, 87% of home health care workers are women. They have been excluded from the protections and benefits of legislation that protects other employees, such as overtime pay. And also, a lot of these in-home healthcare workers are working to keep someone alive or giving them palliative care, but they have no health insurance themselves. When it comes to class and health, the most significant relationship between groups and health outcomes is the linking factor of class. Those who live in poverty experience higher rates of illness. Growing up poor has lasting consequences. Despite an adult's current class status, growing up in poverty impacts your health over your entire lifespan. For example, poor nutrition in childhood would impact cognitive development, which obviously is going to impact you your whole life. Exposure to environmental impacts on health, such as high levels of lead, that's also going to affect development, which would affect someone lifelong. So a lower social class status leads to higher mortality or higher death rates. And it also produces higher rates of morbidity, which is the incidence of an illness. So a lower class social status is also associated with higher rates of mental illness, which is also difficult to address when you live in a country that has a for-profit medical system. So if you have no money, you have no access to treatment or care. So the racial health gap. Unfortunately, this is something that's actually increased in somewhat recent years. It's increased, from the 80s onward as a consequence of the changing dynamics of the racial income gap and widening racial inequality in the culture. So the greatest health disparities in this country are between whites and African Americans and Native Americans. So less access to healthcare and lower quality of healthcare can explain some of the health inequities, but barriers to healthcare is really a factor for a lot of people that are poor, especially Native Americans. African Americans also face multiple barriers because they're less likely to have regular location to seek healthcare or receive medication. And so there's other additional complications as a result. What's interesting is the epidemiological paradox, sometimes called the Latino paradox, where Latinos have less resources on the whole, but face comparable or in some cases better health outcomes than their white counterparts. The reasons why are somewhat hotly debated, though I have my own theories, as I think many studies don't consider diet, which might have an impact on our health, but also, as we discussed before, the impacts of traditional medicine, if that's something that people still use, could have, a big impact on that as well. So pan-ethnic categories can be problematic when we talk about health because they can mask differences within different groups, right? Which is going to influence health outcomes because we're making assumptions of needs based on the large pan-ethnic category with little regard to the specific differences of cultures therein. To further complicate this, we look at the intersectional, right? So African Americans and Hispanics generally suffer from higher levels of chronic disease and disability than white people do. And that, obviously gender also plays a role here. So for example, Black and Hispanic women suffer from chronic illness more than white women. And there are also greater disparities between men and women of color compared to men and women who are white. So the gender health gap is worse among people of color, especially among the Black community. Black women experience the poorest health outcomes, which begin accelerating once they reach reproductive age. And when it comes to disability, white men have the lowest disability levels, followed next by white women and men of color, while Black and Hispanic women experience the highest disability levels. Experiencing overt forms of discrimination negatively affects both the mental and physical health of most minority groups. Racism and stress are key factors in helping to explain why some health inequities increase with age, producing a cumulative disadvantage. So continued exposure to racism impacts people's health, and discrimination can also lead to reduced access to desirable goods and services. So this kind of adds to what we talk about with microaggressions, right? Which are these brief verbal, nonverbal, and behavioral insults to a person or group, whether intentional or unintentional. And they're a form of psychological stressors that are tied to one's identity as a member of an oppressed group. So the impact of microaggressions comes from their cumulative nature, right? The fact that they add up over time. It's not like it happens once, it's that it keeps happening over and over and over and over. And so the way in which they evoke and serve as a reminder of the history of oppression, right? So when you have the examples I have in the slide here, the assumptions about Asians and math, right? How that's going to just kind of continuously remind someone that there has been an inequality and that they're not considered equal, or those kind of things where people say, yeah, but where are you really from, right? Like this woman holding the card here. No, but where are you really from? Right? As if you say, well, I'm from, Torrance or, someplace and, you just give a city or a location. They're like, yeah, but culturally, right? Because basically what they're trying to say is you're not really from here. You're not really American. So those things are microaggressions, right? They add up over time. And again, they serve as a reminder that in some way you're not equal. Research finds that every non-white racial group experiences harm and health risks as a result of these microaggressions. So just like the body reacts to more overt stressors, like, getting in a car accident or something like that, or, maybe studying for finals, those kind of things, the ongoing experience of microaggressions can also lead to physiological problems, meaning it stresses people out. It leads to problems that can weaken their immune system. So internalized racism is the acceptance of society's negative characterization, which can also adversely affect health. So racism can cause increased exposure to traditional stressors like unemployment or poor living conditions, which also lead to, unequal health outcomes. And it should also be mentioned that those who are most affected by the stress of racism are also maybe facing sexism or poverty, right? These other things. They might be less likely to have access to coping skills for mental health functioning as well. So there is a long history or legacy of mistrust for medicine in this country, and there's no, let me say this, how do I say that right? It's logical, right? It's a logical distrust, right? So But the problem is this mistrust of medicine can be a barrier for people of color. But again, given the history of medical experimentation, mistrust is certainly understandable. Sociologists like to challenge assumptions, and medical sociologists argue that medicine itself is connected to the culture. It affects how medicine is studied and understood. So the racial hierarchy can impact or limit what's even imaginable. The best example of this is the condition that the white medical establishment made up during slavery. It was called drapetomania, and it was basically an illness white people made up to try and understand why a person would try to escape slavery. So again, this could only exist within a white supremacist society that sees slavery as the natural role for people defined as inferior, because otherwise white people could have understood why people tried to escape. If they could see past their own privilege, their own experience, and see what we can plainly see today, that slavery was a horror, an anathema to our values as a nation, that no one should be controlled or bought or sold or be in chains. But there were narratives then, and even ones today, that apply this benevolence, like white people were just the caretakers of a lower race of people, like helping. And that slavery stock story said that slaves were happy to be slaves, so if they tried to run away, it must have been an illness. So to deal with this, they would cut off the toes of slaves to prevent them from running away again. I know it's disgusting, but this rhetoric is still something you'll hear on Fox News on occasion. Like when Michelle Obama gave that famous speech about how it felt for her to wake up every day in a house that slaves built. Fox host, that was later fired for so many sexual harassment cases, Bill O'Reilly, did a whole segment on it where he said that slaves that built the White House were taken care of. They had clothes, they had food. Insane, I know. They were enslaved. There's no way you can say that someone's caring for you if you're being controlled and using your labor for free to build their wealth. It's abhorrent. But you still hear these garbage monsters out there promoting these ideas. Another famous study was the Tuskegee syphilis study, the best-known medical experiment on a minority group. It took place from 1932 to 1972, and the government recruited some men with syphilis while not telling them they had syphilis, so they could monitor how the disease progressed. They had a treatment for syphilis within a couple years of starting the study, but they withheld treatment. There was no informed consent in the research, which is what makes it so unethical. Participants were not only not informed about what the purpose of the research was, they told them that the research was about quote-unquote bad blood, which was a local term for conditions including syphilis, but others like anemia or fatigue. And the study was supposed to last for 6 months, but it continued for 40 years. It's estimated that between 28 and 100 of the original 400 men died as a result of not getting treatment. Not to mention their partners and others they had sexual contact with that had contracted the disease. I should also mention the only reason it stopped was because of a whistleblower working at the U.S. Public Health Service. He talked to a reporter to make the story public. So when the government has a documentable history of experimenting on racial minorities, it makes a lot of sense for some people to be skeptical of doctors and medical care in general. Where we live influences our health. We live in segregated housing, which is a significant factor in our health impacts as well. High levels of residential racial segregation in the U.S. persist, and people of color are more likely to be segregated in neighborhoods that are isolated from social services. And they're also in worse living conditions typically, facing greater environmental health threats. At the same time, poor whites are more likely to live in economically diverse neighborhoods with greater access to resources. So, for example, toxic sites are much more likely to be located in poor minority neighborhoods, such as landfills, hazard waste sites, other toxic sites, and people that live in these neighborhoods are exposed to higher levels of pollution, which cause elevated health risks. People of color and low-income whites are more likely to suffer asthma, as an example of this. So neighborhood segregation leads to school segregation, and children of color face greater levels of pollution and lead poisoning at their schools. This, of course, lowers academic performance because it causes organ damage, can cause permanent brain damage, which, obviously can also itself cause permanent behavioral changes and decreased IQs or even death. So epidemiology is the distribution of health issues and health determinants in a population. Epidemiologists focus on populations and try to explain why some groups may be more likely to develop certain diseases, whether due to social groups or to where they live. The Human Genome Project set out to map and sequence the entire spectrum of human genes. As a result of the research, geneticists agree that race has no genetic basis. So their findings were that 85% of our genetic variation is located within so-called races, meaning there's a lot of diversity within race. People categorized as belonging to the same race have very little in common genetically or biologically. So again, meaning there's more variation in between races there's more variation within one race, right? The genetic diversity of what, a pan-ethnic group like Asian means than there is between Asian and another group. So it's interesting, to have the researchers, found this, but of course this is going to change the way that we then socially understand these things. So there's also the case of resisting and transforming health inequalities. So Native Americans face unique circumstances. More than 560 tribes are recognized by the U.S. government and entitled to specific healthcare benefits. But it can be tricky, as an individual has to be legally recognized through a very bureaucratic process as a member of one of those tribes to be eligible. So Indian Health Services began in 1955 and offered services for certain tribes on reservations, but those services were concentrated in areas that had largest Indian populations. And care is not always accessible, and in urban areas where 70% of natives now live, it can be expensive and culturally insensitive, which of course impacts emotional and physical well-being. For example, in the book, research found that American Indians and Alaskan Natives that have moved away from reservations are more than 3 times as likely to die from diabetes-related strokes. Also, another thing to talk about not having mental health and not having other social support services, the suicide rate of urban Native youth is 62% higher than the national average. So clearly there's a consequence happening here of these inequities, and that needs to be addressed so that those youth have a future. So this is an interesting topic. So when we talk about, women's healthcare movement and reproduction, we have to understand this from a racial and ethnic context. During the first wave of the women's rights movement, even talking about contraception was against the law. Margaret Sanger at the time was working as a nurse in the poor immigrant area, and she was in New York, and she was finding women with complications after having many kids. We're talking like 7 to 10 plus births. And they would literally beg her to tell them how to prevent another pregnancy. As they were so poor, they wouldn't be able to afford another child. But of course, patriarchy, as it was, a woman was thought not to have a sexuality outside of childbearing. Women already had families. They just wanted to be able to control the size of those families. And so this impacted Margaret Sanger, and she was arrested for promoting contraception. She distributed it through the mail, and she was jailed for opening the first birth control clinic to provide information to women so they could make their own decisions about their bodies. She founded the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood. She was aware of the barriers that immigrant women faced, and so she adopted the racism and eugenics ideology of the time period that said that birth control would be benefit to society by limiting the number of children born to immigrant families. In doing so, she gained much more public support for her cause. So due to the racism of the birth control debate, Black women sought to educate themselves about birth control through social clubs. As Black women also sought reproductive justice, the right to have children, the right to not have children, and to parent in safe and happy environments. But again, being kind of targets of the eugenics ideology, obviously that would affect, your willingness to hear that message, right? So, when you're being a target of that. So women's educational and occupational opportunities are limited if they have no control over their bodies or reproduction. So, basically women can't have their own jobs, go to school, have those kind of things if they can't control their own reproduction. And so also, once they do reproduce, their economic dependence on men becomes reinforced and solidified, right? Because then they have children to take care of. So today, a vibrant movement is fighting for reproductive justice. Women with disabilities have also embraced a reproductive justice framework based on their own history of sterilization. So obviously, the treatment of people with disabilities was very cruel for many years, still continues to be very unequal. And also, the people with disabilities were always kind of seen as, non-sexual, which affected, their own understandings of sexuality and just, the identities around these topics and, whether or not they get access to sexual health and wellness. So the risks that were posed by genetic testing were also something that was important to, these advocates, because they're pointing out that, women were going through these really risky procedures while pregnant to find out if their baby might have a disability. Why? In an attempt to eliminate the disabled. I mean, that's literally what eugenics was trying to do. They were literally trying to make sure that no one would ever be born disabled. So that's got to feel very threatening as a movement when that's connected to the birth control movement overall, when, again, you're being targeted as unfit. So international NGOs, right, non-governmental organizations, supporting women's health have grown over the last few decades, mostly because U.S. support has declined. And what's interesting is the intersectional nature of women's health, as reproductive health inequalities reflect those existing, inequalities overseas, such as, social and economic inequalities between men and women. But they also reinforce them, and they continue them generationally because they don't give women access to, control over their own bodies. So research has found that more than 1 in 7 married women in developed nations need or want contraception, but they lack access. And this is also true for 1 in 13 women aged 15 to 29 who've never been married. Lacking access is an issue, as is receiving education about contraceptive options. So again, we can see how social status and cultural values have an impact on something as personal as pregnancy and family, which then shapes current and future generations. Because the rich will have access, they have opportunity, and they have ways to avoid social stigma, while the poor worldwide suffer from lack of access. This is further complicated by the global gag rule. This was first put in place by Ronald Reagan in 1984, later repealed, but it was one of Trump's first acts in office to reinstate the global gag rule and actually expand it. The global gag rule prevents foreign organizations that receive U.S. global health assistance, so money, from providing information, referrals, or services for legal abortion, or advocating for access to abortion services in their country, even with their own money. So until we end the global gag rule, the policy will continue to jeopardize the health and well-being of millions of women and girls and the families that depend on them.